At what point do you think a person becomes an enemy? So if you have, say you have a conflict and a certain number of people are involved, and then, the army comes in and you're looking at, okay, like who is potentially part of the opposition and how do we deal with that opposition? So at what point do you think a person becomes an enemy, is part of the enemy?
It depends a lot, I think, on the situation and the individual. Part of the issue was there are lots of people who took part probably in throwing stones at the army and riots who never joined a paramilitary organisation. They probably felt aggrieved at something that the army did, and then there was throwing. It still happens in Belfast, and it also happened by loyalists. Loyalists were rioting as well. So this whole escalation is, from starting off just people shouting abuse right through to throwing stones to getting into a riot to eventually using firearms is all part of that. Now, how do you defuse that situation? How do you cool it down? And that's one of the big challenges, because fundamentally that is a police operation. The trouble is, when you send in troops who are armed, and an army is trained to fight a war, they're not trained to be police officers. That was my first argument about the troubles in Derry back in August 1969. The RUC were not properly trained, not properly equipped to deal with what was fundamentally just a big demo. And we see them now, in France and all around the world. But because it became reached the stage where the RUC were in a state of collapse, only then were troops put on the street, because there was going to be no police force if they didn't do that. You've immediately then started the escalation, and we never got back from that. It was our inability, I think, to get out of that and get it back to a normal policing operation that was the big failure. And that led to the rioting in Belfast the following night, and to even greater destruction, and even more troops came in.
And then you moved over to England, and you were summoned to Salisbury.
I moved to my new post, which was at headquarters, North West District, and I literally arrived, and a day after that, a police officer from Northern Ireland arrived, and with a special branch officer from the Lancashire Police, and said that they were investigating the fact that I had given a restricted document to a journalist.
What was your reaction when you, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this came?
Well, the first thing I was mystified, because I couldn't say to the police, because I wasn't allowed to say what I was doing, but for the past 6 years I'd been supplying, as part of my job description, highly sensitive information to journalists from different countries around the world. And literally in December, when I was moved, I was actually in the process of disseminating a secret dossier to journalists about IRA financing and arms trafficking. So my job description was about, as the Army subsequently admitted in 1990, was sharing information with the press that was highly classified. And now I've got the police arriving on my doorstep because I've given the press a document that's the lowest possible form of classification. Even the army maps of Belfast are classified restricted. Merlin Rees, when he wrote his memoirs, he had a copy of the army map on the cover. So he's breaking the Official Secrets Act. It literally was almost lunacy at that stage. But as part of my situation vis-a-vis the Official Secrets Act, I had to get clearance from the MOD. So I told the police I would have to consult the MOD before I spoke to them at all. And I arranged to do that. But in the meantime, as part of my transfer to England, I had to report to Salisbury, which was then the headquarters of the army in the UK. And so I went down to see the staff there before taking up my duties in Preston. And then I just arrived in Salisbury when my headquarters in Preston rang up and said, "Oh, I have to return to Preston right away." So as a went through London, I called into the MOD to see the head of Army PR and told him what had happened. And I specifically said to him, what information can I give the police, bearing in mind that one of the police officers is a member of the RUC? And we had a major problem because of links between the RUC and paramilitaries. And he said to me that I could tell them about PSYOPs activities directed at Republicans, the IRA, but not directed at loyalists. So I went back to Preston and I did that. I then had a meeting with the two police officers again, and I gave them a brief on what my role was in Northern Ireland, and I gave them a list of activities directed at the IRA but not at Protestants. And that was basically it. But of course the danger of that was that years later, because I didn't include my activities directed at Tara and William McGrath in that briefing, the MOD said that because I didn't tell the police about Tara and McGrath, I obviously didn't know anything about it. But the MOD had specifically told me not to talk about any loyalist operations at all.
And then the next step was that you were asked to take voluntary redundancy.
Yes. Yeah. I was told that I was going to be removed from my job. I appealed against that, and then at the appeal hearing, the appeal said that I shouldn't be forced to resign. I should be allowed to resign, which meant I could keep my pension. But what was really interesting was that at the hearing we discovered that the panel were not made aware of my secret job description. We were not given a copy at the hearing of my job description. And also, one of my superiors at Lisburn, who was due to attend and give evidence, he didn't turn up. So we were left with, almost a false hearing where the case rested by default. And at that stage I realized that actually the disciplinary action had been rigged, because that was so unfair in terms of any management process, any government management process. And I then was quite worried about it, because I thought clearly there is more to this than I'm aware. So I decided that although the MOD told me I could not engage a solicitor who was not approved by them, who was not cleared by them, I actually went to a solicitor. Just it happened to be the first solicitor's office near where I lived at that time. I got off the train, there was a solicitor's office, walked in, and I briefed one of the partners of the firm. And he was very good. He actually took what I was saying seriously, despite the bizarre story. And then he and I went to see our local MP, who just by chance was a minister at the Northern Ireland office. He was a Labour MP. And so I gave him a brief about the Clockwork Orange programme and my concerns about that, particularly where it was targeting politicians and so on and so forth. And then later he came back and said that there was nothing he could do to help. Now we've got the correspondence between him and the MOD, and it was quite clear that the MOD and the Northern Ireland office weren't telling him the truth at that stage. They were holding information from him. But by that point, there was really nothing more I could do, so I accepted the retirement, and that was it.
And also, could you include how you discovered that MI5 had made an assessment of you saying you were disgruntled?
Later, from documents disclosed for one of the inquiries, the correspondence between MI5 and the Northern Ireland office said that I was a disgruntled employee, and therefore from that point of view would have been a security risk in terms of vetting. The fact was I wasn't disgruntled at all. I was literally just trying to get a fair hearing, and it was like a Hitchcock film. I was employed to do something. I was recommended 3 times for the MBE for doing a good job. I had all my confidential reports. I was the youngest senior information officer in the Ministry of Defence, and yet, I went from there to being moved out of Northern Ireland on a totally spurious disciplinary charge. And the reason, of course, why that information, that true fact didn't come out was that the MOD covered up the true nature of the work I was doing in Northern Ireland. And that was, you know, grossly unfair.
Could you describe when you hid your information policy files, at what point in time that was and why you did that?
At the time of my disciplinary hearing at the MOD, one of the things I told the Minister of Defence was that when I left Northern Ireland, that I still had 6 outstanding projects to complete, because I left Northern Ireland at very short notice. And those 6 activities were all PSYOPs linked. And one of them was the latter part of Clockwork Orange 4. And it was agreed between me and my superiors at Lisburn, and with the knowledge of MOD, that I would finish those as soon as possible when I took up my new post, because clearly anybody taking over from me in Northern Ireland wouldn't know the background. It'd be very, very difficult to do that. And I further agreed that I would return to Northern Ireland in February. That was about 6 weeks later, and I would then speak to the head of the Army PSYOPs unit to see what further work needed to be done. So I took with me all the notes that I needed for those 6 projects, none of the actual documents which were left on file back at Lisburn, but I took my working notes so that I could complete the work. When my disciplinary hearing was finished and I realised that clearly it had been rigged, and I then engaged a solicitor purely for personal protection to tell him what had happened to me, I decided that because I was then living in rented accommodation in South London, that I would put all my notes into a place of safekeeping. So I had them all parcelled up and stored somewhere a long way off from where I was living.
This is after your conviction. How long did it take before you decided you were going to try and kind of reach out to politicians and the press? Because I read some things that you were already contacting or writing to the press in 82 from prison. Or...
In 1982 was the Terry inquiry was set up, and I was named in Parliament by Jerry Fitt MP on the basis that I had briefed the press in 1973 about Tara and McGrath. So he asked in the House if I could be called to give evidence to the Terry inquiry. So he put on record the fact that, you know, as early as 1973 I had been talking about Concora. And then my solicitor was contacted by a number of journalists as a result of that, both from Northern Ireland and from England. And I think we did some statements via my solicitor. I'm not quite sure at that stage what it was, but it was basically of a holding nature, because the officer who'd been in charge of my wrongful conviction, he was now a member of the new investigation into a cover-up by the RUC of Concora. And my solicitor and I agreed that until we could get these matters resolved about possible conflict of interest, that we shouldn't make any comment at all to see whether I would be authorised under the Official Secrets Act to participate in the police inquiry. So there was a period of some months of dialogue really about this issue, and the press were following that quite closely at that time.
Lobster issue 11, you made, as far as I understand, that you kind of made the transition into a kind of actor in the public domain, because you were quite clearly quoted, you know, this is Colin Wallace, this is what happened to him. Did you, was this something that you thought about or discussed beforehand with Robin Ramsey about identifying yourself? Because hitherto you were kind of shy about, also in information policy about being named.
I was, but then I think that, particularly after my conviction, I realised that a lot of the things that happened to me didn't happen by accident. And I thought the biggest danger that I had was not actually explaining in clear terms what happened to me. I was more at risk as long as, in fact, the full story was out there. So I thought the best thing to do was, when I was released from prison, and I knew that they would try to keep me in as long as possible without parole, that I would then write to my Member of Parliament via my solicitor. He had then been engaged in trying to get me clearance under the Official Secrets Act to talk to the Terry inquiry. So it was all part of that dialogue then that I realised that there was something that really was very unsavoury about all of my experiences after I left Northern Ireland. And the only way to deal with that was to get the whole affair looked at properly by some impartial investigation. The problem I think I felt was, because clearly someone was manipulating my life behind the scenes, if I didn't challenge it head on, it was going to go on and on again. And there was no guarantee when I came out from prison, now with the prison record, I was going to be any better off than I had been beforehand. So the only thing I could do then was to challenge the whole system head on. So I petitioned the Home Secretary over the quality of the evidence provided by trial. I also then started writing to General Garrett at the MOD, who was then Director of Army Security and had been my Chief of Staff at Lisburn, who knew me very well, really with a view to participating in first of all, the Terry inquiry, and then the Hughes inquiry, led by Judge William Hughes. And really what I wanted to do, I wanted a proper inquiry where there could be a cross-examination of witnesses so that I could actually bring my account of my knowledge of McGrath, Kincora and related matters into the public domain, but also to get access to some of the documents that I felt were germane to my wrongful conviction.
How did it feel, this is going back to your trial, but how did it feel having journalists who you had known and supplied information to and had relationships with in Northern Ireland suddenly referring to you as a Walter Mitty and a fantasist?
Well, one of the things that we now know that journalists, a few I must admit, were then used by the government to try and discredit my allegations. One of the key things that the documents that have been released show that the authorities were keen to get me prosecuted in 1975 for giving a restricted document to a journalist because it would then discredit my allegations. And I think that gave that was the sort of key to what this was all about. Clearly, for some reason or other, the intelligence services thought that at the end of 1974-75, I was going to disclose something. And what they wanted to do was discredit my allegations. And that comes out absolutely clearly in a discussion between MI5 and legal officers at the Northern Ireland office. Now, in the end, the Attorney General decided I shouldn't be prosecuted because the nature of the work I was doing and the fact that the document was only restricted. But I think since that, then there were attempts, clearly planted information. For example, I think it was 1987, The Independent ran a large story about Fred Holroyd and myself saying that our allegations about collusion were total rubbish and so on and so forth. Now, that was interesting because I took the Independent to the press complaints body and they upheld my complaint. Paul Foote then looked at how the story was created and they wondered where the information came from. Well, we now know that the information used by the Independent actually was held by the RUC. And what's more interesting, we now know from documents released MI5 notes of a meeting with one of the Sussex police officers during a Terry inquiry that a senior officer involved in the Kincora investigation was blamed by the Sussex Police for leaking information to the press during that investigation. So it's quite clear that the RUC and possibly others felt that what Fred Holroyd and I were saying was somehow a threat to some of the unlawful activities that were going on in Northern Ireland at that time. That was not basically our intent. We didn't want to be involved in a dispute with the MOD or MI5. I still don't. I'm involved with a dispute with certain people who basically lied for years about my role, misled Parliament, and because the system has not dealt with that cover-up, with that misleading information, Fred Holroyd and I had no choice but to fight. That was it. I mean, there was absolutely nothing else that we could do. And that's really what we've been doing. And still, the authorities are grudgingly withholding information that goes back over 40 years. And there can be no justification whatsoever. That information is no longer, should no longer be a matter of national security. More recent files of sensitive information have been released. So for the benefit of all those people involved in our joint cases, and there are lots of people who've been hurt by this, there does need to be a thorough examination. And ideally that should be something along the level of a judicial inquiry where all documents have to be disclosed and witnesses have to be called. And I make this point because the most recent inquiry into child abuse in Northern Ireland, the HI inquiry, we know, for example, that despite all the inquiries, government agencies, the Foreign Office, for example, had correspondence from Hugh Mooney and others that I had briefed them about Tara in 1973 and the abuses at Concora. Hugh Mooney was never asked to give evidence to the police, nor to any inquiry. Why? The journalist who interviewed him was never asked to give evidence to inquiry. The MI5 member who typed my Clockwork Orange notes, which was denied by MOD, she was never questioned by the police, or if she was, there's no statement ever produced. So how is it that these high-level investigations into alleged cover-up have studiously avoided taking evidence from key witnesses? That's not the way a true inquiry operates. And to this day, the MOD have still not disclosed to Parliament the justification for my job in Northern Ireland, which sets out in detail, 4 pages long, possibly 5, in detail what I was required to do. Now that's grossly unfair. The successive governments have refused to look at it. I've still got inquiries in, both with Westminster and with the Northern Ireland office for inquiries. Nothing has happened.
Thank you. Could you describe how the review of your dismissal came about?
In 1989, Sir Michael Quinlan, who was the permanent Under Secretary to the Minister of Defence, he was told by a member of staff at the MOD that they had found in a file a reference to Clockwork Orange. And up to that, the MOD had pointed out that there no such operation has existed, and indeed I had no role in psychological operations. Sir Michael Quinlan is one of the few people to come out with credibility on this, and he, as a result of that information, advised Tom King, who was the Secretary of State for Defence, about the find. Tom King then wrote to Margaret Thatcher, who, to be fair, then agreed that a confidential internal investigation should be carried out. That investigation was carried out by a Mr. Rooker, who was a senior figure in MOD security, and he wrote a very good report. But the weakness of that report was that he did not speak to me at any stage. He relied purely on information on file. What he did discover was that in 1976, after I left Northern Ireland, the majority of the files that I had created in the PSYOP unit were destroyed, And in 1981, when McGrath was arrested, the remainder of the files were destroyed. And he rightly criticises the destruction of those files because they were classified, and classified files have to have a record of when they're destroyed and who authorised the destruction. Now, the Army do not go around destroying files, particularly when it's an issue that has drawn a lot of attention, like my case. My case has never really gone out of the system because either my lawyers were involved with MOD or the inquiries were. So what we do know is there was a wholesale destruction of evidence following my departure from Northern Ireland, and that enabled the MOD during the Hughes inquiry, and more particularly during the HIA inquiry, to claim that they could find no evidence to substantiate my allegations. Well, of course they couldn't find evidence. They destroyed it, and they knew they destroyed it. And so there we are at the moment. We have this totally unaccountable action by people in Whitehall who have spent most of the time just trying to cover up the nature of what we were doing in Northern Ireland, rather than say, yes, it happened, we're sorry we got it wrong, or we were justifying it was the right thing to do. Nothing. But literally, that deception is still going on. And even the Defence Select Committee, who have the right to have an oversight of the MOD, they were refused point blank to be given access to those documents. That has got to be wrong by any imagination.
Have you ever had any martial arts training?
None whatsoever. All soldiers do very basic, what we would call, not really martial arts, but by arresting people and being able to hold them in grips and so on and so forth when they're involved in rioting. And that's standard procedure for everyone, but that's vastly different to what the Home Office pathologist described as an expert blow. An expert blow. Indeed, it was so expert he consulted an American Secret Service officer. And that seems quite remarkable that the person doing it wasn't someone who had simply read a book or had a passing knowledge. It had to be done by somebody who was well versed in martial arts. That was a very important part of the evidence that he was forced to disclose at the time of my appeal, and one of the reasons why the conviction was quashed.
Robin Ramsey mentioned that you received help from a retired MI6 officer. Could you talk about that a little?
Well, I was approached by, first of all, one MI6 officer, Anthony Cavendish, who was in MI6 during the war, who was a very close friend of Sir Maurice Oldfield, and was probably Sir Maurice Oldfield's closest friend. He contacted me because Maurice Oldfield had told him about my case, but he also knew that Maurice Oldfield had told Harold Wilson about Clockwork Orange. Now, I also know separately that Tam Dael had been told by Maurice Oldfield that he was uneasy about the way my case had been handled. And then separately, George Kennedy Young, who was one of the senior officers at MI6, who was a friend of Tony Cavendish, he met with me and Tony Cavendish on 2 or 3 occasions, and he was interested in the circumstances of my removal from Northern Ireland. And the reason for that was that Sir Maurice Oldfield was sent to Northern Ireland by Margaret Thatcher in 1980. And after he arrived in Northern Ireland, the RUC Special Branch, and I believe MI5, were really angry that he had been given the role of coordinating intelligence in Northern Ireland. And he was basically sent in by Margaret Thatcher to resolve some of the abuses that are now very much part of the debate in Ireland. And so what happened is the Special Branch planted a story with the Sunday Times that Sir Maurice Oldfield had sexually assaulted a man in a pub in County Down in Northern Ireland when he was there. Now, when Tony Cavendish, when we looked at that, we realised the story had to be fake because Maurice Oldfield didn't drive. And when he was in Northern Ireland, he was surrounded by bodyguards everywhere he went. So when he was in the pub, he was well and truly protected and observed. Then when Robin Ramsey was working with Channel 4 television, Channel 4 went to the pub where the assault allegedly took place, and the owner and the staff who were on duty on that occasion were all interviewed, and they said the incident never happened. So it looks as though, because the special branch were aware of Maurice Oldfield's homosexuality, what they did was they used that knowledge to plant a story in the paper that forced the homosexuality issue out into the public domain, and as a result, Maurice Oldfield had to resign from his post in Northern Ireland and come back to England.
Do you think your story may have been used by MI6 in a kind of rivalry between MI5 and MI6?
I'd thought about this, but there are several reasons that I don't think that's true, because MI6 would not have known how I reacted or would have reacted. My working knowledge with the few members of MI6 that I had dealings with was very good. And I found that what they were doing in Ireland fitted very much with my own view of trying to get some sort of political dialogue going to eventually bring about some type of agreement. So I don't have any arguments with MI6 about any of my experiences in Northern Ireland. So while they could have done that, I think that is too ham-fisted an approach to. There are lots of easier ways of doing the story than doing that, because I think, in all honesty, MI6 wouldn't have wanted my allegations to come out in public as well, because indirectly they were involved with some of the things we were doing in PSYOPs, and I just feel that that's not credible.
A general question about intelligence services. Should intelligence services be independent and unaccountable?
No, if you believe in democracy, and that's the cornerstone, then everything then becomes subject to the democratic principle. And that goes right through, from the point of view of the way the courts are set up, right through the way the law is created, the way the police forces operate, and the intelligence services have no greater authority than that. They are crown servants, and therefore they're paid by the public, they have a clear role to do, and they should be held accountable. But there has to be proper oversight, and that oversight has to be genuinely independent. And if you don't do that, then the big problem is that it ends up where there's no real trust in the security services. And we saw what happened in Northern Ireland. When that goes wrong, you get all sorts of abuses, because people know that even if the system disagrees with them, they can't afford to punish them, because that would bring the information out into the open. So I believe passionately in oversight, and I don't believe it's beyond the ability of the state to produce people who would have oversight and be agreed by all parties. There are lots of people who, for example, ex-judges who would make a very good panel for scrutiny, and ex-intelligence officers on it as well. But it's got to be something that is credible, and at the moment that is the big weakness. There is no credible supervision.
Why is it of continued importance to shine a light on what's happened in Northern Ireland after so many years?
Well, where I'm shining light is in a very narrow front. There are a number of, I believe, horrible miscarriages of justice. There's the Dublin bombings in 1974, McGurk's bar in 1972, and all the different allegations of collusion between the paramilitaries and between members of the security forces. There's a string of cases at the moment called legacy cases in Northern Ireland. They've been going on for years. The authorities have been dragging their feet. They're refusing to release information. And the problem is that delay is only making things worse. It's making things worse. Most of the people are now dead, but it's making it bad for their relatives and for their families as well. And if Northern Ireland is going to move forward, and it has moved forward really after 2 generations, then these issues must be put to bed once and for all to the satisfaction of those involved. And there is no sign at all that the government is really making a determined effort to speed up that process.
Why do you think politicians are reluctant to challenge intelligence services or stand up to them?
I think they believe, and to some extent they're right, that the intelligence services have a lot of influence over their political careers. So if a politician is a career politician and they want to become a minister or become part of the Privy Council, then the vetting would involve MI5. And if MI5 decide to put a black spot against them, it's highly likely that they will never really get access to really sensitive information that they would need to if they held ministerial office. Now, whether that is true or not, the perception is there, and that perception is adequate, I think, to frighten a lot of politicians away from trying even to raise these issues.